During the spring of 2007, I found myself as a substitute English teacher for second-grade public school students in the town of Marilao, Philippines. The days were hot and humid, and the air reeked of pollution, but I was in the company of lovely Filipino people who smiled every time and found me infinitely interesting just because I was white. Cliff's Notes, good beer, cheap food, and sunsets that scorched and shone beautiful and red at the same time. At this time, I met the loveliest little boy. His name was Rodrigo Alvarez. On the day I first talked to Rodrigo, I was having rice porridge for lunch, sticky, gingered rice porridge, flecked with red-hot chili oil, sitting by the tree, waiting for the heat to pass. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, was running towards me. His clothes were dirty, and his khaki shorts had smears of dirt all over them. He had a huge smile. "What you doing?" he said, in thickly accented English. "Are you eating, Teacher Carl?" I laughed and smiled. "Yep. Yes, I am, Rodrigo." "Good? Delicious," he said. He mimed putting a spoon into his mouth while smiling and making contented sounds. "Yummy," he said happily. Yes, it is, Rodrigo," I replied. "Would you like some?" He shook his head at first, but I caught him staring at my bowl as I continued eating. Eventually, I insisted that he try a little bit at least. He smiled widely, with his nose flecked with dried snot, and then he took the spoon off my hands and devoured the rest of my porridge. I noticed that he was incredibly skinny, with his skeletal arms and a belly that distended outwards like a balloon. When he noticed that the bowl was empty, he became incredibly apologetic. "Sorry." "I'm so sorry, sir," he said, clasping his hands as if in prayer. I shook my head. "It's okay, Rodrigo, no worries," I said happily. "You were really hungry, weren't you?" He stared at the ground, kicking at the small pebbles in the soil. He nodded. "Did you have breakfast?" I said. "You should have breakfast before coming to school." He shook his head. No breakfast," he muttered. "My family is." He continued, as he scratched at his head for a bit. He then thrust his hands toward me, then formed a circle with his thumb and index finger. "We have no money. Do you understand?" he said. I nodded. "Yes, Rodrigo, I understand," I said. "Does anybody work in your family?" He shook his head sadly. "Only Bertie, my big brother," he said. "He's 12. He works by the market as a melon boy." "Your mother works there too?" I asked. Rodrigo shook his head. I pinched the bridge of my nose and sighed. That didn't sound like a lot of money. A wet market where they sold food, fruits, vegetables, meat for incredibly cheap. There was no way his big brother could have afforded to source fresh fruit by himself. I've seen them around, children stealing from roadside vendors, selling their loot by the roadside, stolen fruits stacked on top of plastic tarps. The thought broke my heart. "Listen, Rodrigo," I said. "From now on, you can share my lunch, okay?" He tilted his head, curious at first, and then he smiled. He then laughed, wrapped his tiny arms around my neck, and gave me a big kiss on the cheek. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you very, very much." He was a rambunctious kid, a little fireball that zipped by everywhere. He was incredibly playful and would spend his days teasing his classmates and dragging them over to play. You would always see him soaked in sweat, his starched white uniform streaked with soil and tree leaves, and whatever mess he found it fun to roll in. There was never any malice in it, however. There was always an innocent wonder. He was always happy, and he only got happier as we spent days sharing our meals. I began to look forward to our time underneath the trees, where he would come by and we'd share stories. And boy, did he talk. He told me he wanted to be a paleontologist when he grew up, not a lucrative dream in the Philippines, but I encouraged him no less. I had a passing interest in dinosaurs, so I wowed him with descriptions of the ones I was familiar with. So 4 people stood on top of each other. That would be how tall a Tyrannosaurus Rex is, I said. His jaw dropped, and then he yelped in excitement, bending his arms against his chest and mimicking what he thought a T-Rex would look like. I laughed heartily. But he wasn't happy all the time. One time, he came to me wearing a face weighed down with the mass of a life I couldn't even imagine. "What's wrong?" I asked him as he picked at the bowl of rice I had for him. "Kuya Birdie's not making too much money. I think I need to help him," he whispered. "Are you gonna sell melons as well?" I said. He suddenly looked up, then smiled with the haggard tiredness of someone way older. "Yes," he replied. "Can you not tell my classmates?" I nodded. "Of course, Rodrigo," I said. "I'll tell them you went on vacation or something." Life rolled on, at the pace that it does in Marilao. Both slow and ruthless, I slowly came to realize that it was a town where everyone survived at any cost. The ones who didn't disappear floated in the background, while the gears ground on unfettered. Rodrigo came to class less and less. I know that the thing to do would have been to intervene in his life somehow, but it wasn't my place to do that. I'm only a visitor, a temporary passenger in Marilao. At any time, I could go back to comfortable Sydney, whereas some of the people here didn't have a choice. I was in no position to dictate what their lives should be, I thought. And then, Rodrigo stopped coming altogether. It would be a few weeks before I would start asking questions. Where was he? Did anybody know where he lived? Was he ever coming back? It took a stray question from my colleagues to find out the truth. Rodrigo Alvarez, at age 8, had died. I was crushed. In my grief, I asked everyone I could about Rodrigo with sudden desperation. Could I have saved him? And crumbs of information filtered down like puzzle pieces. The directed questions that followed pointed to a stranger's truth at the core. He was found in the back of an abandoned van, dressed in a skirt and a pink shirt, with mascara drawn over his eyelashes. A pair of lips, drawn with lipstick, was found by his neck. He was surrounded by 5 or 6 empty beer bottles. There was a man's shirt, size XL, found by the front seat, and a motel room key that didn't go anywhere. I went back to Sydney. Soon afterward. The world was brutal, and I could handle most of what it could throw at me, but this was just strange. I didn't have any answers. No whys, no whats, no hows. Just Rodrigo, dead in the middle of nowhere, in circumstances I couldn't even begin to fathom or rationalize. I went on with my life somehow. Some nights, thoughts of Rodrigo growing up, a world-famous paleontologist, would haunt me. Through that, I managed to finish university and shake off the wanderlust on my feet. I found a job. I was to start a family. His ghost, bright and furious and forever young, slowly drifted in the background. It wasn't until I told this story to a colleague that he haunted me again. As I described Rodrigo and what he had to do to survive, my coworker looked at me, aghast. Oh God, he said. Oh, Jesus. What? I asked him. You know what melon boys are, right? He whispered. You know what the term means? What? No, I stammered. What else could it? It's melon as in firm and round on the outside, and soft and sweet on the inside. Oh God. Rodrigo was a sex worker, Carl. I'm so sorry, my coworker said.